like it means nothing.
Thank you, and welcome. Before I start, I'd like to say thank you to the Disobey staff and volunteers, and would you please give them a round of applause? Thank you. Today, I'm going to talk about a ransomware attack and data exfiltration which disrupted a prison's critical systems, including multiple legacy systems, causing chaos and uncertainty among the staff and inmates. Ideally, they would have acted quickly to assess the damage, secure their systems, and restore normal operations as quickly as possible, but you'll see that didn't happen. The impact on daily prison operations and inmate management was significant, and they could have communicated clearly with staff and inmates to maintain order and safety. This was a challenging situation, and as you'll see, there was a complete lack of coordinated response. That amplified the chaos, and it caused the prison to emerge weaker initially. As I give this talk, please bear in mind that years later, this is still making its way through the court systems, and some information may not be divulged for legal reasons. So first, who am I? My name is Richard Suls. I'm a senior security advisory consultant at WithSecure, based in New York City, although you all may probably know that WithSecure is based in Finland. And here's a little bit of further information about me. There will be contact information on the last slide as well. So let's get into it. This was an attack that was entirely preventable at multiple levels. But due to a series of critical failures, it escalated into a full-scale breach with lasting consequences on inmates, staff, and even people who had applied to be staff 10 years prior. One untrained and unsuspecting user, we think from the medical unit, clicked on a malicious link, we think. It could have been a malicious link. It could have been a malicious attachment. We will never know. And it provided attackers with the initial foothold that they needed into this network. From there, they moved laterally through the network. They compromised nearly every system. We've never found evidence that they even needed to escalate privileges. The breach wasn't just about the initial phishing email. Multiple systematic failures occurred and contributed to the disaster. And the prison relied on outdated legacy systems with poor patching hygiene, had no structured incident response plan whatsoever, and crucially, once the attack was underway, they mishandled the response step after step. Instead of preserving logs and evidence for investigation, all systems were wiped, effectively erasing any trace of what happened and making recovery even more difficult. And the fallout was severe. The attackers not only encrypted all their backups, rendering them useless, but they exfiltrated 250 gigabytes of data, much of it PII and NPI. The IT staff ignored multiple warnings from the threat actors, including direct contact attempts, and this led to a full-scale data leak onto the dark web. The result, a massive breach, nearly completely operational paralysis, and significant reputational damage for the institution itself. This case is a stark reminder that cybersecurity is not just about technology, it's about preparation, awareness, and effective response. So let's take a deeper look at how this incident unfolded and what lessons we can learn from it. Before we dive deeper into the breach or the attack itself, we need to understand the environment that made it possible. It wasn't just a single point of failure, though obviously the phishing point was the initial incident. But it was a systematic issue that had been building up over years, creating a perfect storm for the attack to succeed. This IT environment had been operating for over 2 decades, and it'll become painfully obvious to you as I describe some of the things that were still in it, that some things had never been replaced or even considered. It was running on outdated software and hardware, which had long exceeded their support cycles. Many critical systems were unpatched, leaving them vulnerable to known exploits. And without updates, attackers had an easy path to gain access and move laterally through the network. Beyond outdated systems, basic cybersecurity hygiene was severely lacking. There were no structured patching processes. None of the Windows workstations had been hardened in any way, shape, or form. IT's lack of proactive security measures significantly increased the risk of compromise. So what was the most damaging issue here? Was it the complete absence of an incident response plan? When the attack occurred, IT staff had absolutely no established procedures to contain, analyze, or mitigate the incident. Instead of preserving forensic evidence, they basically taking any kind of structured recovery steps. Systems were wiped in a sheer panic, erasing every chance of possibly understanding what happened or how to respond or learn from the incident. So much of what occurred actually had to be pieced together later. And these three factors, legacy systems, poor security hygiene, and the lack of an incident response plan, created an environment where an attack was not just possible, but inevitable. The consequences of this neglect became painfully clear as the incident unfolded. Let's take a closer look at how the attack played out. Like many modern breaches, it wasn't an instantaneous event. It unfolded in multiple phases, each escalating the impact. It began with a simple yet highly effective phishing email. An employee at the prison clicked on a malicious link or opened an attachment, as I said, we'll really never know, and unknowingly provided attackers with initial access into the network. This is often the weakest link in security, as most of us know, human error. Once inside, the attackers quickly gained access to the system. As a result of weak security measures, outdated software, and poor policies, they were able to move deeper into critical infrastructure with absolutely no resistance. There was no monitoring, no alerting mechanisms that were in place to detect this activity. There was no MDR software, and an older, well-known that I won't name, but let's say it's just a Russian antivirus, didn't detect the problem at all. The attackers expanded their reach within the network easily. They used simple, common techniques such as mapped network drives to move laterally, gaining access to additional servers and workstations. And since there was no proper segmentation of the network, the movement was entirely unrestricted. Finally, after maintaining access and collecting sensitive data, the attackers executed their end game. They exfiltrated 250 gigabytes of data, including massive amounts of personally identifiable information and non-public information, later leaking it onto the dark web. The prison IT staff missed multiple warnings, including direct contact from the threat actors, until it was too late. The result was a catastrophic data breach with severe operational and reputational consequences. And, might I add, a vulnerable population made further vulnerable. This timeline highlights how a lack of security fundamentals, such as phishing awareness, network segmentation, and monitoring, can allow an attack to escalate rapidly. Next, we'll explore exactly how the prison responded to this crisis and where things went wrong. Once the email was successful, the attackers moved quickly to exploit weaknesses in the system, and we'll never know if this was a manual attack or most likely it was an automated attack. The malware, once executed, took advantage of unpatched software vulnerabilities. These were well documented. We're talking about things like Samba v1 not being disabled. So obviously known fixes, very easy. But because the prison's IT environment was outdated, their staff overworked, and not well trained, they remained exposed. This allowed the attackers to execute code remotely, gain persistence, start escalating their access. And when I say escalating, again, we don't ever think that privilege escalation occurred. So with a foothold inside the network, the attackers basically had an access to their PII. They were on users' local folders, moved from years of one machine to the next. We saw documents that were over 10 years old with social security numbers in them from people who had applied to become staff there and never made it. There were older, unpatched Exchange servers, which were obviously an easy target. They were publicly exposed, so it really, again, it's just a matter of time before this happened. Because no effective monitoring or security alerts were in place, the activity went completely undetected until the threat actors had done everything they had wanted. And speaking of Exchange servers, it was later found out that hundreds of employees had access to external email. In other words, they were able to email to an external domain. We performed an audit of who needed access to send and receive emails between external domains post-incident and found it to be less than 50 people. So this incident could have been prevented right there. Once the attackers gained an initial foothold, they moved through the network with minimal resistance, as stated. The prison's weak security practices allowed them to spread without needing to escalate their privileges. And let's break down quickly why this happened. First major issue was the complete lack of network segmentation. Systems and user accounts had excessive default permissions. There was an opportunity essentially for attackers to navigate through the network without restriction. Ideally, critical systems should have been isolated, requiring additional authentication and monitoring. But instead, attackers could freely access multiple machines and servers, including many unprotected RDP endpoints, for instance. One system that was properly isolated, thankfully, were the prison doors. They were never touched by the threat actors, but during post-investigation, I actually determined that that was dumb luck. One of the prison guards, had plugged the otherwise isolated system into a second Ethernet port because they wanted access to the internet while on door duty. Making matters worse, this sensitive data, PII and NPI, was readily available everywhere, from administrators' desktops to network shares, and the attackers found documents containing PII that were stored in user folders for over a decade. Without any kind of proper data governance policies in place, old records remained accessible for convenience purposes, long past their necessary retention periods. No security controls in place to detect or block unauthorized activity caused the attackers to move freely through the network, and they accessed the shared folders of users and network servers, user directories, and they had access to administrative tools without even triggering alarms. A properly implemented least privilege model may have contained the damage, but in this case, open access allowed them to collect a vast amount of sensitive data before moving on to their final phase. At this point, they had complete control over the environment, and in the next phase, they exfiltrated the stolen data and carried out their final devastating act, publicly exposing 250 gigabytes of confidential prison records. So now they executed the final blow, basically crippling the prison's IT infrastructure and leaving no easy path to recovery, aka the ransomware part of the attack, or encryption part of the attack. One of their actions that they took was to encrypt all available backup files. Backups weren't properly secured, meaning they were accessible from the compromised systems. The attackers had no problem locking them down, just another open shared file on the network. There were no offline, air-gapped, or immutable backups whatsoever. And so the prison lost its ability to restore systems to a clean state in any kind of efficient or timely manner. Another unknown that we'll probably never know, did the attackers purposefully encrypt these backups, or was it just part of this automated attack potential? Again, in a panicked response, IT staff began wiping systems in an attempt to remove the malware. They collected them all into the biggest meeting room they could find, took them all offline, took all the boxes off, wiped the hard drives. Didn't reinstall Windows, just wiped the hard drives first. It was an interesting move. As a result, all their workstations, their servers, their critical infrastructure, gone, making incident investigation, impossible, and prolonging downtime oddly and unnecessarily. So with no backups and very few functioning systems at all, the entire prison IT environment was rendered more or less useless. Communications, security systems, and administration was totally impacted. And this type of catastrophic failure is exactly what incident response planning is designed to prevent, of course. In this case, the lack of a structured plan made the situation significantly worse than it needed to be. So at this point, the attack caused irreparable damage. But the worst was actually yet to come, and the stolen data was about to be exposed on the dark web. One of the most critical failures in the incident, again, was the lack of logging and forensic evidence. Without proper record of what had happened, responding to and learning from the attack became nearly impossible. From the start, the prison's IT systems had poor logging practices. Security logs were far too limited to provide meaningful insights. And this meant that when the attack occurred, there was little data available to track the attacker's movements anyway, identify affected systems, or understand how they gained access in the first place. We had to anecdotally rely on the word of someone from the medical unit that they clicked on the phishing email to figure out that that may have been the point of entry. The prison utilized at that time a single sonic wall, which had outdated firmware and expired licenses. In an attempt to contain the threat, IT staff made a critical mistake. They wiped their systems without backing up any forensic data. And this reaction, likely due to a lack of training and incident response, eliminated crucial evidence that could have helped us understand remediation, attribution, and post-incident analysis. Because there were no useful logs and evidence had been erased, investigating the attack was extremely difficult. The organization had no clear understanding of the full scope of the breach, how much data was taken, or whether backdoors had been left behind. Without visibility, recovery efforts were slow, and the reinfection likelihood remained high. So at this point in the attack, the threat actors had already exfiltrated sensitive data, and instead of staying silent, they chose to send a warning. A chance for the prison to react, an opportunity for them to be paid. But that opportunity was completely ignored. The attackers posted samples of the stolen data online as proof of their access in a 5-gigabyte chunk. It was mostly medical records, it was encrypted, and the password was posted on their website on the dark web. It's a common tactic that was used at that time for double extortion ransomware attacks, where threat actors demand payment not just for decrypting the systems, but also to prevent leaked data from being publicly released. IT staff did download the sample file, but despite the clear warning and evidence that this was their data, they either dismissed or overlooked the significance of the attacker's message, thinking and saying at that time, they're not going to post the full batch. I'm not entirely sure what led them to that, but I don't think they actually had the money to pay the ransom anyway. So no investigation was initiated, no external cybersecurity assistance was sought at that time, and no containment efforts were made. Whether due to a lack of awareness, training, or leadership involvement, this failure to act would end up having devastating consequences. Had the IT team responded appropriately, they may have contained the breach to the 5 gigabytes, potentially limiting further exposure of staff and inmates and would-be staff. Instead, their lack of action meant that the threat actors proceeded with their plans, escalating the situation even further. This was the first major warning sign, but it wasn't the last. So these threat actors typically want to get paid. That's what they're here for. Sometimes they're there to sow chaos, as we know. But this particular group wanted to get paid. So what did they do? They called the prison's front desk. They basically said, we're looking for money, and they were ignored. Unusual, but increasingly common that we're hearing things like this happen, especially at that time. Now, again, several years passed. The attackers made it clear that they had control over the stolen data, and they basically said, pay or we're going to release the whole thing. It was a critical moment where the prison had the opportunity to acknowledge the breach, maybe engage in a negotiator, and attempt some form of confinement. They did none of that. Whether due to a lack of awareness, internal miscommunication, or a simple failure to take the threat seriously, no action was taken. The inaction meant that the attackers had no reason to hold back. So the next step was inevitable. At this point, the worst case scenario unfolded. the attackers followed through on their threats and dumped 250 gigabytes of sensitive data onto the dark web, exposing the personal and financial records of millions, some duplicates, staff, prisoners, and trainees who failed to become staff. The breach never obviously disappears. Once the data is leaked, it remains accessible to cybercriminals indefinitely. And the consequences extend far beyond this specific event. Identity theft, fraud, physical threats — remember, these are prison guards — and even blackmail are now real possibilities for those affected. Stolen social security numbers, financial details, and personal records can be exploited for years. This massive data exposure could have been prevented at multiple points, as you've heard already, through better patching, stronger incident response practices, taking these threat actors seriously, basic cybersecurity hygiene. Instead, a lack of action allowed the attackers to escalate to this final devastating stage. So what are the consequences and impact? Well, as I've mentioned, there's still legal battles being fought, and the threat actors basically followed through on their promise, leaking these 250 gigabytes to the web. What lessons can we learn from this beyond the normal consequences? Beyond the immediate technical and operational fallout, the breach carried serious legal and regulatory consequences that are still playing out. Given the nature of the data involved, sensitive criminal justice records and personal medical information, the prison was in direct violation of multiple compliance frameworks. The two most significant violations were against the Criminal Justice Information Services, CJIS, regulations, and HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, both United States-based frameworks and regulations. This did happen in the United States. CJIS compliance governs how law enforcement and criminal organizations handle sensitive information, criminal justice organizations, excuse me. The exposure of prisoner records, law enforcement reports, and other restricted data represents a clear breach of these requirements. The lack of access controls, failure to protect data at rest and in transit, and the complete absence of an incident response plan all indicate non-compliance. The consequences could include fines, increased regulatory scrutiny, or in this case, the complete shutdown of the facility. HIPAA violations are equally severe. The prison facility stored medical information about inmates, including diagnoses, treatments, and medical health records. The data breach exposed all of this information, violating HIPAA's requirements for safeguarding electronic protected health information, or EPHI. Given the scale of the breach, this could result in significant financial penalties and legal action, again, still ongoing. Failure to meet these compliance requirements not only puts the organization at risk of legal penalties, but also erodes trust in the institution. Regulatory bodies demanded corrective action of the institution, and in extreme cases, they could demand leadership changes or additional external oversight. So this situation underscores why cybersecurity must be treated as a compliance priority rather than an afterthought. Again, I feel that this entire incident was preventable at multiple points, and the weaknesses that allowed this breach to escalate were all avoidable with basic security hygiene. 4 fundamental measures: patching, IR planning, staff training, and network segmentation could have significantly reduced the risk and impact of this attack. I should note at this time that the camera systems were on a physically separate network, showing that the staff understood these needs, but either couldn't or didn't fully comply with them in other places. Regular patching, you've heard me say this several times now, is one of the simplest and most effective ways to prevent cyber intrusions. Many of the vulnerabilities exploited in this attack existed because legacy systems such as Windows 7 and, yes, Windows XP in a few cases had not been updated. Keeping software and systems current with security patches would have closed the gaps that the attackers used to gain further access. A well-documented IR plan could have changed the course of this breach. Instead of panicking and wiping systems, IT staff could have followed a structured response, preserving the minimal logs that did exist, containing the attack, potentially, and mitigating damage. Without an IR plan, there was no coordination, leading to poor decision-making that worsened the situation. Staff training is critical in preventing phishing attacks, which remain the #1 initial access vector for cybercriminals. Employees must be able to recognize suspicious emails, verify sources before clicking links or downloading attachments, and understand the importance of reporting potential threats. A well-trained workforce is a key line of defense. Instead, it became a key place for entry. Proper network segmentation would have prevented the attackers from moving laterally with ease. There was no, again, evidence that this was a sophisticated attack. They may not have needed to be sophisticated, quite frankly. But by limiting access to critical systems and enforcing least privilege, the impact of a compromised user account could have been contained. And instead, the lack of segmentation allowed the attackers to spread freely across the entire prison infrastructure. Another method of prevention that could have been helpful would have been proper document management with a system that encrypted them at rest. No such system was in place, despite free and robust options being available. Had one or more of these measures been in place, this incident could have been prevented or significantly minimized. Instead, the prison suffered complete operational failure and this devastating data breach. This incident serves as a cautionary tale, reinforcing critical lessons for all organizations that handle sensitive data. The first key takeaway is the importance of proactive security measures. Preventative controls such as patch management, endpoint protection, detection, and strong authentication and phish-resistant security practices could have stopped this attack before it escalated. Security must be an ongoing investment, not just a reaction to an incident. Equally important is incident readiness. Cyber attacks are inevitable, not if, but when, and organizations must prepare for them. With robust incident response plans, well-trained staff, and clear protocols for containment. In this case, the lack of a coordinated response led to catastrophic failures, and having an IR plan in place, tested and rehearsed, ensures the teams can act decisively rather than reacting in panic. Finally, continuous monitoring is essential for detecting threats before they cause damage. Regular security audits, log analysis, which was not done at all, and proactive threat hunting could have identified the attacker's movements early, preventing the widespread compromise. Security isn't just a one-time effort. It requires ongoing vigilance and adaptation to emerging threats. Good job, security. What logs did they have? You might ask. Well, their sonic wall was configured to log some activity and to dump its log into an email to the department once a day, and then erase it. With the email server compromised beyond repair, there was no way to tell if the threat was logged at all. So by implementing some or all of these lessons, organizations may avoid similar disasters. It's not just an IT issue, cybersecurity. It's an organizational priority that requires leadership, investment, and a culture of preparedness. I frequently tell my clients when we're talking about advisory security, this is for the benefit of your budget. We can help you to prove to your leaders why you need more money. And to be fair, IT never had a seat at the leadership table prior to this incident. They were literally placed under the leadership of facilities management, the janitorial staff. I don't know about you all, but I'm old enough to have worked in IT in the basement next to the janitorial staff once. It's not a great feeling, and you certainly don't feel empowered to make better changes to your IT environment. Recovering from an incident of this scale requires structure and a strategic approach, and the first priority is incident response. Even though the attack has already caused significant damage, a thorough investigation is essential to understand how the breach occurred, assess the full scope of compromised data, and determine whether any backdoors remain that could allow future attacks. A forensic analysis should be conducted to identify security gaps and prevent recurrence. They did more of a slash and burn technique. Next, security awareness must be significantly improved across the organization. So they were basically at that point forced. They were given a mandate by the warden. We need to make this better. This can't happen again. So employees needed to find a way to do comprehensive training on phishing threats. They needed to train up their staff about password hygiene and about best practices for identifying and reporting suspicious activity. This was not done in increments. It was a massive undertaking because it had never been attempted prior. Again, this is why security is an ongoing and a constantly moving process. Nobody wants to have to forklift from one place to another as quickly as possible. Finally, backup improvement was a necessity for these people. They actually had a secondary location with an entirely separate closet that could have provided an air-gapped backup. They weren't making use of it. They do today. And this offline air-gapped kind of and versioning type backup that they've implemented, obviously a little late, will help them should or when this kind of attack occurs next. One of the most common reasons organizations fail to implement strong cybersecurity measures is a lack of funding. We hear this regularly. However, this incident makes it clear, and made it very clear to the administration here at this prison, that the cost of not investing in security is far higher than the price of prevention. This chart highlights key areas where funding is required to build a secure infrastructure for this particular organization's purposes. Hardware upgrades for them represented the largest expense. The prison relied on outdated systems, as I've kind of hinted at, and they were difficult to patch, if they had even tried, and they lacked modern security protections. Upgrading to current hardware with built-in features, such as EDR capabilities, hardware that was capable of running EDR without bogging down, that is, would drastically reduce vulnerabilities. When I arrived on the scene, I found a brand new firewall in their rack, never configured, never turned on. Security software is another critical investment. Firewalls, intrusion detection systems, endpoint protection, and email filtering solutions could have prevented this phishing attack and possibly stopped the malware from spreading. The cost of these tools is minimal compared to the financial and reputational damage that was caused by this breach. Consulting is an essential but often overlooked component of security strategy. And I'm biased, I'm a consultant, lifelong, but I think bringing in external security experts to assess risks, develop an incident response plan, and conduct penetration testing ensures an organization isn't solely relying on internal resources that may lack expertise and maybe don't see the forest for the trees. Finally, staff training is one of the most cost-effective security investments. The entire attack stemmed from a phishing email, something that could have been prevented through awareness training, maybe, through phishing training. Educating employees on how to recognize these threats, report suspicious activity, and follow security protocols is an ongoing process, but it's significantly cheaper than dealing with a breach. Also, it's not that fun, but it's a lot more fun than dealing with a breach. Prior to the breach, there were no staff training protocols whatsoever, and this has been since remedied through this expensive lesson. So why are we talking about this? Well, it's obviously interesting to talk about the failure of an organization and how we can learn from it, but there are also opportunities here. This organization is not unique. There are many like it that have been around for decades and are relying on ancient hardware, untrained staff, and this poses a clear need for cybersecurity expertise. These institutions, especially government and public sectors, lack internal resources or specialized knowledge to protect themselves, and that creates a humanitarian and financial opportunity for cybersecurity consultancies to step in, offering guidance, assessments, and hands-on solutions. Beyond providing services, it's an opportunity to do good while doing well. And that's the message I'd really hope that you leave here today with from this talk, is that we can help people while also doing our jobs. Cybersecurity professionals can offer impactful solutions that balance financial concerns with societal benefit. By leveraging grants, public funding, or tiered pricing models, security firms can make cybersecurity more accessible to underfunded institutions while still maintaining sustainable business growth. Protecting critical infrastructure, law enforcement data, and vulnerable populations isn't just good business. It's a necessary public service. Lastly, cybersecurity and legacy system upgrades represent a major market opportunity. Many institutions operate on outdated infrastructure, creating a dire need for modernization services that focus on security hardening, employee training, and resistance planning. Offering scalable, tailored services to address these vulnerabilities is a high-impact way to improve their security posture. Again, to me, the takeaway is clear. Cybersecurity isn't just about preventing breaches. It's about building a stronger, more resilient digital ecosystem. Those who can bridge the gap between expertise and implementation will play a vital role in securing institutions that desperately need protection. So, offering a few final takeaways. This incident, again, provides a clear and urgent message. Cybersecurity cannot be treated as an afterthought, and I'm sure most of you don't want it to be. The key takeaway is that organizations must prioritize security as a mission-critical function. No longer should we be placed next to the janitor's closet. The warden of this institution learned that lesson just a little late. Cybersecurity threats are not a hypothetical risk. They're a reality that impacts organizations of all sizes and all industries. And leadership must embed security into every level of operations, ensuring that policies, procedures, and infrastructure reflect a proactive approach to risk management. The second lesson is the importance of investing wisely. Cutting corners on cybersecurity often leads to much higher costs in the long run. Sufficient budget must be allocated for security software, employee training, hardware upgrades, and expert consulting. A well-funded security program is far less expensive than the fallout from a data breach, which includes regulatory fines frequently, operational downtime, and reputational damage. Finally, organizations must stay vigilant. Security is not a one-time fix. It requires continuous monitoring, regular audits, and an adaptive mindset to address the emerging threats. Threat actors are constantly evolving their tactics, as we all know, and security teams must do the same. Ongoing training, proactive detection mechanisms, and incident response readiness are all essential components of our toolkit. By applying these lessons, organizations can protect themselves from falling into the same disastrous situation. Cybersecurity is not just an IT problem. It's a leadership issue, and it demands ongoing commitment and action from them. Thank you for your time and attention throughout the presentation. Please reach out with any follow-ups, questions, or comments.